Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Is that a knockoff? Silas Vance sneered, fingering Elena's collar in front of the dinner guests as they stepped out of their town car. The fabric of her blouse felt thin under his rough, judgmental touch, but she didn't pull away. She stood perfectly still on the marble steps of the estate, the very house she had spent the last 5 years paying for in secret. Beside Silas, Beatrice Vance adjusted her pearls, her gaze skipping over her daughter as if she were a smudge on an otherwise pristine window. Two of the city's most influential developers, the Whitmores, watched the exchange with forced, polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the heavy, expensive cologne Silas favored, a bottle Elena had bought him for Christmas. "It's just cotton, Dad," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor against his rising tide of arrogance. He let out a sharp, barking laugh and turned to the guests. "You see, we try to give her the best, but she insists on dressing like a charity case. It's embarrassing, really. You'd think a daughter of mine would have more respect for the family image." "Silas, dear, don't badger the girl," Beatrice said, though her tone lacked any real sting. She smoothed the front of her silk gown, a designer piece that had cost 3 of Elena's nursing shifts. "She's been at the hospital all day. God knows what kind of germs she's bringing into the foyer." Elena felt the familiar prickle of heat behind her eyes, but pushed it down. She looked past them toward the grand staircase, where Julian Vance was descending. Her brother looked every bit the successful prodigy their parents believed him to be, dressed in a bespoke Italian suit. He didn't look like a man whose gambling debts had nearly seen him jailed 6 months ago. He didn't look like a man whose venture capital firm was actually a series of empty bank accounts kept afloat by Elena's overtime pay. "There he is," Silas beamed, his chest swelling as he clapped Julian on the shoulder. "The man of the hour. Julian just closed a massive deal in the city. We're celebrating tonight." Julian flashed a blinding, practiced smile at the Whitmores. It was nothing, really, just a matter of timing and leverage. He glanced at Elena, his eyes cooling. "Elena, be a sweetheart and go tell the kitchen we're ready for the first course, would you? And maybe change into something that doesn't smell like a pharmacy." The guests chuckled, a soft, polite sound that felt like a whip crack against Elena's skin. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold, hard edge of the brass key Arthur Sterling had handed her only yesterday. It was the key to a private vault, one containing the original deed to this very estate, a deed that bore only one name, Elena Vance. "Of course," she said quietly. She walked toward the kitchen, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. She could hear Silas's voice echoing in the dining room, bragging about the vintage wine he'd pulled from the cellar. It was a 1982 Bordeaux. Elena knew exactly how much it cost because the charge had appeared on her credit card statement 3 weeks ago, hidden under the guise of a household maintenance expense Silas had submitted. As she passed the mahogany sideboard, she saw the mail. A thick envelope from Arthur Sterling sat at the bottom of the pile. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Arthur was the only one who knew the truth, that when Silas had faced bankruptcy 5 years ago, it wasn't a silent partner who had saved the family legacy. It was the daughter he treated like a servant, funneling every cent of her inheritance and salary into a trust to keep the roof over their heads. She slipped the envelope into her waistband, hidden by her cardigan. Dinner was an exercise in endurance. Silas held court at the head of the table, pouring wine he hadn't paid for into crystal glasses he didn't own. "The problem with the younger generation," Silas said, gesturing with a fork toward Elena, "is a lack of ambition. Elena is content to spend her life cleaning up after strangers for a pittance. No vision, no drive. Julian, on the other hand, understands that wealth is a responsibility." "Actually," Julian added, leaning back as a maid served the poached salmon, "I was thinking about the East Wing. I'm going to need more space for my new consultants. Dad, I think it's time Elena moved out of that suite. The garden cottage is sitting empty, isn't it? It's more her speed anyway." Beatrice nodded in agreement. It's a lovely idea, Julian. It would be much more private for her, and we could turn her current room into a proper office for your firm. Elena felt the cold condensation on her water glass. The audacity was a physical weight in the room. They were discussing evicting her from her own master's suite, the one she had chosen because it caught the morning sun, to give her brother more room to play at being a businessman. The garden cottage has a leak in the roof, Elena said calmly. Silas waved a hand dismissively. Then fix it. You're handy, aren't you? Or use some of that hard-earned money of yours to hire a contractor. Don't be selfish, Elena. Your brother is doing big things for this family. She looked at the faces around the table. Silas's face was flushed with wine and self-importance. Beatrice was looking at her with a mixture of pity and annoyance. Julian was already checking his reflection in the silver cake server, adjusting his silk tie. They had no idea. They truly believed the ground they walked on belonged to them by divine right, rather than by the grace of the woman they were currently trying to banish to a drafty shack. Elena felt a strange, icy calm settle over her. The sleeping lion wasn't just a nickname Arthur had used for her. It was a description of the fire that had finally caught a spark. She thought of the documents in the envelope, the ones that proved Silas had defaulted on his private loans to her trust 3 months ago. Technically, she could have them all removed by the sheriff by morning. "You're right, Dad," Elena said, standing up slowly. The room went quiet as she pushed her chair back. "Wealth is a responsibility, and it's time I started taking mine more seriously." Silas blinked, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? Sit down, we haven't had the dessert yet." "I'm not hungry for dessert," she replied, her voice echoing with a newfound authority that made the Whitmores exchange a confused glance. She looked directly at her father, seeing the rot of his entitlement for exactly what it was. "I have a meeting with Arthur Sterling at 8 tomorrow morning. There are some structural changes coming to the estate." "Structural changes?" Beatrice asked, her voice fluttering. "What on earth does that mean?" Elena didn't answer. She turned and walked out of the dining room, her head held high. Behind her, she heard Silas start to bluster, his voice rising in an angry demand for her to come back, but she didn't stop. She reached the foyer, pulled her phone from her pocket, and dialed a number she had memorized weeks ago. "Arthur," she said as the door clicked shut behind her, the cool night air hitting her face. "It's Elena. Proceed with the formal notice. I want it delivered during the brunch tomorrow." "Yes." In front of everyone. She ended the call and looked up at the darkened windows of the house. Tomorrow, the Vance family would find out exactly who had been holding up the walls of their world, and she was very much looking forward to watching them crumble. The following morning, the terrace of the Vance estate was bathed in a deceptive, golden light. The scent of blooming jasmine mingled with the rich, oily aroma of Silas Vance's imported cigars. He sat at the head of the wrought iron table, his silk robe shimmering as he gestured with a silver fork toward the manicured lawn. Beatrice sat to his right, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses, picking at a plate of smoked salmon as if the food were beneath her. Julian Vance was already on his second mimosa, his laughter echoing too loudly across the stone patio. He was scrolling through his phone, showing Silas a photo of a sleek, matte black sports car. "I'm putting the deposit down this afternoon," Julian bragged, his voice thick with unearned confidence. "The firm had a record quarter. It's about time I drove something that reflects my status." Elena stood in the shadows of the French doors, still wearing her blue nurse's scrubs. She hadn't slept, but the exhaustion was eclipsed by a cold, vibrating clarity. She watched Julian, the brother whose record quarter was actually a series of bailouts she had funneled through Arthur Sterling to keep him from bankruptcy. Julian didn't have a firm, he had a playground, and she had been the one paying the rent. "You're still here." Silas's voice cut through the air like a dull blade. He didn't look up from the morning paper. "I assumed after your tantrum last night, you'd have slunk back to that hospital. You look haggard, Elena. It's bad for the family image to have you loitering around in those rags while we're trying to have a civilized meal." Beatrice sighed, the sound of jewelry clinking as she adjusted her pearls. Really, dear, your father is right. If you can't afford to dress for the occasion, at least stay in the servants' wing until the guests arrive. We're expecting the Sterlings shortly. Elena stepped out onto the terrace, the heels of her work shoes clicking sharply against the marble. The sound was a harsh contrast to the soft morning atmosphere. I'm not staying for the mimosas, Mother. And Julian, I wouldn't put that deposit down just yet. You might find your liquidity a bit restricted. Julian snorted, his lip curling in a sneer that mirrored his father's. What would you know about liquidity? You spend your life cleaning up after people who can't afford a decent insurance plan. Stick to the bedpans, Elena. Leave the high finance to the men. Silas finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. That's enough. Elena, apologize to your brother for that structural changes nonsense you spewed last night. You've had your moment of rebellion. Now go upstairs, wash that hospital smell off you, and prepare to be useful. I need you to sign over the management rights for the North Acreage. I found a developer. Elena felt the weight of the phone in her pocket, the screen already glowing with a confirmation text from Arthur. She looked at the sprawling estate, the fountain she'd repaired, the roof she'd replaced, the taxes she'd paid under a corporate veil Silas was too arrogant to pierce. He truly believed the ground beneath his feet stayed there by his own command. I won't be signing anything, Silas, she said, her voice low and dangerously steady. Silas slammed his hand onto the table, making the crystal flutes rattle. You will address me as father, and you will do as you are told. I have spent 20 years maintaining this legacy while you played martyr in a clinic. Everything you see belongs to the Vance name. Actually, a new voice interrupted, that's exactly what we're here to discuss. The heavy iron gates at the end of the driveway groaned open. A black sedan rolled slowly toward the house, its tires crunching on the expensive gravel Silas hadn't paid for. Arthur Sterling stepped out of the car, carrying a thick manila envelope embossed with a legal seal. He didn't head toward Silas. He looked directly at Elena and gave a single professional nod. Beatrice stood up, a fake, practiced smile plastered on her face. Arthur, you're early, Silas was just saying. Arthur didn't return the smile. He stepped onto the terrace and placed the envelope on the table, right on top of Julian's phone. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of a lawnmower. Silas Vance, Beatrice Vance, Julian Vance, Arthur said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. I am here in my capacity as the trustee for the Mercer Estate Holdings. I have been instructed to deliver a formal notice of eviction and a full audit of all misappropriated funds. Silas laughed, though the sound was brittle. Eviction? Arthur, have you lost your mind? I own this house. My grandfather built this house. Arthur looked at Silas with something bordering on pity. Your grandfather lost this house in a private sale 20 years ago, Silas. It was bought by a silent partner to keep you from the streets. That partnership has dissolved. Elena stepped forward, her shadow falling across Silas's plate. The structural changes have arrived, she whispered. Arthur opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it toward Silas. The owner is exercising her right to reclaim the property. You have 48 hours to vacate. Silas's hand trembled as he reached for the paper, his eyes darting to the name at the bottom of the deed. Elena watched the color drain from his face, the arrogance vanishing to reveal the hollow, frightened man beneath. The countdown had officially hit 0. 2 hours later, the sterile, biting scent of antiseptic in the hospital break room felt like the only thing keeping Elena Vance grounded. She sat on a plastic chair that creaked under her weight, staring at the steam rising from a paper cup of bitter coffee. Her shift at the clinic had started an hour ago, but the adrenaline from the confrontation at the estate still hummed in her veins, a cold current that refused to settle. The phone in her pocket buzzed, the vibration jarring against her hip. She didn't need to look at the caller ID to know who it was. The persistence was a hallmark of his desperation. She answered on the 4th ring. Yes, Silas. You listen to me, you ungrateful little thief. Silas Vance's voice came through the line, distorted by a rage so thick it was almost feline. I don't care what kind of forged scrap of paper you and that traitor Sterling cooked up. That house is mine. I am the patriarch of this family, and you are a fluke, a mistake your mother made that I've had to pay for every day since." Elena leaned back, her eyes tracking the flickering fluorescent light above her. She felt a strange, detached pity. "The deed is registered with the county, Silas. It has been for years. You didn't pay for me. I paid for you. Every bottle of scotch, every failed investment, every cent of Julian's tuition, it all came from the mistake you're currently screaming at." "I will see you in the gutter," he roared, the sound of glass shattering in the background punctuating his threat. "I'm calling the police. I'm calling the papers. I'll tell them you've been elder-abusing a grieving widower to steal his inheritance." 47 hours, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through his shouting. "The locks change at noon on Thursday. I suggest you start with the basement. There's a lot of rot down there." She hung up before he could respond, her fingers trembling only slightly as she set the phone on the table. She reached into her bag and touched the corner of a heavy, cream-colored envelope. It was the secret power she had carried for 5 years, the forensic audit of the family accounts. It didn't just show she owned the house. It showed that Julian's venture capital firm was nothing more than a shell used to siphon her nursing salary into Silas's gambling debts. The door to the break room swung open with a violent bang. Julian Vance stood there, looking every bit the golden sun in a charcoal suit that cost more than Elena's car. He looked wildly out of place against the linoleum and the vending machines, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and fury. "Elena, what the hell is wrong with you?" Julian demanded, not bothering to lower his voice as 2 other nurses glanced in from the hallway. "Dad is losing his mind." "Mom is upstairs in hysterics, clutching her pearls like the world is ending. You can't just evict your own parents. Think about the optics. I have a merger closing next week. If the board hears my family is in a public property dispute, it'll tank the valuation." Elena stood slowly, her height nearly matching his. She could smell his cologne, a cloying, expensive scent that reminded her of every holiday he'd spent bragging about his success while she washed dishes in the kitchen. "The optics, Julian. Is that what you're worried about? Not the fact that you've been living in a house you don't own, funded by a sister you treat like a servant." "You're a nurse, Elena," Julian sneered, stepping into her personal space, his eyes darting around to ensure they had an audience. "You're a glorified maid in scrubs. You don't have the capacity to manage an estate like the Vance Manor. You probably stole those documents from Arthur's office while he wasn't looking. Give me the deed, and I'll make sure Dad doesn't press charges. We can tell everyone it was a misunderstanding, a mental break from overwork." The rage spike hit her then, sharp and hot. He wasn't just asking for the house, he was trying to gaslight her into a psychiatric diagnosis to protect his merger. "You want the deed?" Elena asked, her voice dangerously calm. She stepped closer, forcing him to take a half step back. "Then you can buy it. The current market value is $4 million. Since you're such a successful venture capitalist, that should be pocket change for you. Or you can take your hysterics and your charcoal suit and help Silas pack, because in 2 days, the maid is taking out the trash." Julian's jaw tightened, his handsome features contorting into something ugly and small. "You think you're so smart, but you're alone, Elena. No one in this town will look at you when I'm done. You'll be the woman who threw her family on the street for a power trip." "I'm not alone," she replied, picking up her coffee. "I have the law, I have the deed, and for the first time in 30 years, I have the keys." She walked past him, her shoulder brushing his with enough force to make him stumble. She didn't look back as she headed toward the ward. A few minutes later, her phone chimed. It was a text from Arthur Sterling. "The security team is briefed. The locksmith is scheduled for 12:01 p.m. Thursday. I've also secured the records for the Julian Vance Foundation. It's worse than we thought. Are you ready for the next step?" Elena looked at her reflection in the glass of the medication cabinet. The tired, invisible woman was gone. In her place was someone who had spent a lifetime being underestimated, and she was finally ready to collect the debt. "I'm ready," she typed back. "Start the structural changes." The countdown was no longer just a threat, it was a promise. She had 46 hours left to watch the world Silas and Julian had built on her back slowly, painfully, begin to crumble. And she wouldn't miss a single second of it. The following Wednesday, the air inside the Vance estate felt heavy, thick with the scent of expensive cedarwood and the cloying, floral notes of Beatrice Vance's perfume. Elena Vance sat at the long mahogany table, her fingers tracing the cold, silver edge of her fork. Across from her, Julian Vance was animatedly describing the guest list for the Foundation's inaugural gala, scheduled for the following evening. "The governor's office confirmed," Julian said, his voice brimming with a self-importance that didn't match the emptiness of his bank accounts. He didn't look at Elena. To him, she was part of the furniture, a silent witness to his ascent. "This gala will solidify the Vance legacy for the next 50 years. Silas Vance sat at the head of the table, his eyes gleaming with a predatory pride. He reached for his wine glass, the crystal catching the light of the chandelier. "It's about time this family took its rightful place again. No more scraping by, no more living in the shadows of past mistakes." He paused, his gaze drifting toward Elena, turning cold. "Which is why, Elena, I'm asking you to stay in the kitchen tomorrow night. We have professional staff for the event. Your aesthetic doesn't quite fit the image we're projecting." Elena didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of water, the cool liquid a sharp contrast to the heat of Silas's disdain. "My aesthetic." "Don't be difficult," Beatrice Vance interjected, her voice airy and dismissive. She was busy rearranging the lilies in the centerpiece, her movements frantic and shallow. "You look tired, dear. All those double shifts. It's better if you just rest. We wouldn't want the donors asking why the daughter of the house looks like a common laborer." "I'm not tired, Mother," Elena said, her voice steady. She looked directly at Silas. "In fact, I've never felt more awake. And I wouldn't miss tomorrow for the world. I've made some structural changes to my schedule." Silas let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Structural changes? Listen to you, trying to sound like a businesswoman. You're a nurse, Elena. You change bandages and take temperatures. Leave the structures to men who understand how the world actually works." The arrogance in his voice was a physical weight in the room. He truly believed he was the architect of this empire, oblivious to the fact that every brick had been bought with Elena's sacrifices. She felt the heavy envelope in her bag, tucked beneath the table, the final documents Arthur Sterling had delivered an hour ago. "I understand how things work better than you think," Elena replied, her tone deceptively mild. "For instance, I know that if a foundation is built on a hollow core, it doesn't matter how much gold you leaf onto the walls. Eventually, the weight of the lies becomes too much for the frame to bear." Julian scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Is that some medical metaphor? Save it for the ward, Elena. Tomorrow is about success, real success." "Is it?" Elena asked. She leaned forward slightly, the movement drawing the attention of Marcus Thorne, Silas's longtime business associate who had been strangely quiet throughout the meal. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he watched her. He had always been the smartest man in Silas's circle, and for the first time he looked at Elena not as a daughter but as a threat. "Silas," Marcus said softly, his voice cutting through Julian's bragging. "Perhaps we should listen to what she's saying." Silas didn't even turn his head. "She's talking nonsense, Marcus. She's jealous. Always has been. She can't stand that Julian is the one carrying the torch while she's stuck in a hospital basement." He pointed a finger at Elena. "One more word of gloom and you can leave this table. You're here by my grace, remember that." "I'll remember," Elena said. She stood up, the chair legs scraping softly against the marble floor. "I'll remember every word you've said tonight. But before I go, Silas, I want to give you one piece of advice. Check the locks on the study, and perhaps review the deed to this house. You might find that the grace you're so fond of isn't yours to give." Silas froze, his glass halfway to his lips. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. For a fleeting second, a flicker of doubt crossed his face, a shadow of the man who had lost everything once before. But then, the mask of arrogance slammed back into place. "Get out!" Silas hissed, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Get out of my sight before I have you removed." Elena didn't wait. She turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing with a confidence that felt like a drumbeat. As she passed Marcus, he didn't look away. He saw the fire in her eyes, the cold, calculated precision of a woman who was no longer playing a role. Outside, the night air was crisp. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text to Arthur Sterling. The warning was delivered and ignored. Proceed with the midnight filing. Tomorrow, the Vance legacy ends. She looked back at the glowing windows of the estate. Inside, they were celebrating a victory that had already been stolen from them. They had 24 hours of delusion left, and Elena Vance was going to enjoy every second of the countdown. The evening of the Vance Heritage Gala arrived with a stifling, humid heat that even the estate's industrial-grade cooling system couldn't quite mask. This was the pinnacle of their social calendar, a night designed to project an image of old-money stability and effortless grace. In reality, the air inside the grand ballroom tasted of expensive lilies and the metallic tang of desperation. Elena stood at the periphery of the room, her fingers lightly brushing the smooth, cold silk of her navy dress. It was a simple garment, devoid of the aggressive branding her mother favored, yet it fit her like armor. She watched the guests circulate, the local elite, the business partners, and the hangers-on who hovered near the open bar like moths to a flame. They were the witnesses she needed. Every person in this room was a pillar of the social structure Silas Vance had spent 40 years building on a foundation of her labor. Across the room, Silas was holding court. He looked every bit the patriarch in his tailored tuxedo, a glass of vintage scotch in one hand and the other resting heavily on Julian's shoulder. He was laughing, that deep, booming sound that used to make Elena feel safe, but now only made her skin crawl. It was the sound of a man who believed he was untouchable. "You look like you're calculating the cost of the chandelier," a low voice murmured beside her. She didn't need to turn to know it was Marcus. He stood a respectful distance away, a glass of sparkling water in his hand. His presence was a steadying force in the chaos, a reminder that not everyone in this room was blinded by the Vance name. "I'm calculating the cost of the silence," she replied softly, her gaze never leaving her father. "It's been very expensive for me, Marcus." "The price is about to drop," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Arthur just walked in, he's at the north entrance." Elena caught sight of Arthur Sterling. The lawyer looked out of place in the festive atmosphere, his expression grim and his briefcase gripped tightly at his side. He didn't approach her. He didn't need to. The single, sharp nod he gave her was the only confirmation she required. The midnight filing was complete. The digital ink on the property transfer was dry. The Vance legacy was no longer a legacy. It was a debt, and she was the only one holding the ledger. The sound of a silver spoon striking a crystal flute cut through the chatter. The room began to settle, the guests turning their attention toward the small mahogany podium at the front of the hall. Silas stepped up, his face flushed with a mixture of alcohol and pride. "Friends, colleagues, family," Silas began, his voice amplified by the hidden speakers. "Tonight is more than just a celebration of 50 years of the Vance name. It is a celebration of the future." Elena felt a sharp poke in her side. She turned to see Beatrice Vance standing there, her neck draped in a diamond necklace that Elena had paid for 3 Christmases ago. Her mother's eyes were narrowed, her lips pulled into a tight, performative smile. "Stand up straight, Elena," Beatrice hissed under her breath. "And for heaven's sake, try to look happy for your brother. This is his night. Don't ruin it with that dour face of yours." "I'm not the one who's going to ruin this night, Mother," Elena said, her voice remarkably calm. Beatrice scoffed, adjusting her lace shawl. "Always so dramatic. Just stay in the shadows if you can't be pleasant. Nobody came here to see the help, even if you are family." The insult didn't sting. It couldn't. Elena simply watched as her mother moved toward the front, eager to be in the splash zone of the upcoming announcement. Silas continued his speech, his rhetoric growing more bloated by the second. He spoke of the weight of the crown and the sacrifices made by the men of this family. He didn't mention the nurses' shifts that had covered the mortgage when the firm took a dive 5 years ago. He didn't mention the secret wire transfers that had kept Julian out of legal trouble during his university years. "And so," Silas boomed, gesturing for Julian Vance to join him on the podium. It is my greatest honor to announce that as of tomorrow morning, I am officially naming Julian as the sole successor and majority stakeholder of the Vance estate and all its holdings. A polite round of applause rippled through the room. Julian beamed, puffing out his chest, looking every bit the prince who had inherited a kingdom he hadn't lifted a finger to build. It's a heavy responsibility, Julian said into the microphone, his voice dripping with unearned confidence. But I think I've proven that I'm more than capable of handling the family's assets. After all, someone has to keep the legacy alive while others find themselves. He looked directly at Elena as he said it, a smirk playing on his lips. The guests followed his gaze, their eyes landing on her. She saw the pity in some, the dismissal in others. They saw a quiet daughter who had been passed over, a girl who didn't have the business mind required for such a grand inheritance. Elena felt her phone vibrate in the small clutch she held. She didn't need to look at it. She knew it was the final confirmation from Arthur's team. The public records had been updated. The trap was set. She began to move, not toward the shadows, as her mother had commanded, but toward the center of the room. Her heels clicked against the polished marble, a rhythmic, predatory sound that seemed to sync with the beating of her heart. Marcus stepped aside to let her pass, his expression unreadable but his stance supportive. Silas was still talking, detailing the grand renovations Julian planned for the estate, blissfully unaware that he was describing plans for a house he no longer owned. He was laughing again, a sound of pure, arrogant triumph. Elena reached the base of the podium just as Silas was raising his glass for a final toast. The light from the chandeliers caught the gold rim of his flute, making it sparkle. He looked down and saw her, his smile faltering for only a fraction of a second before the mask of paternal condescension returned. "Ah, Elena," Silas said, his voice booming over the microphone so the entire room could hear. "Don't be shy. Come up and congratulate your brother. Even you should be able to appreciate what this means for our family." The room went quiet, the guests leaning in, sensing the shift in the air. Elena didn't climb the stairs. She stood at the bottom, looking up at the two men who had spent her entire life using her as a ladder. "I do appreciate it, Silas," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the sudden silence of the ballroom, it carried to the furthest corners. "I appreciate it more than you can possibly imagine." She reached into her clutch and pulled out a small, folded document. It wasn't the original. That was safe in Arthur's vault, but the certified copy was more than enough. She didn't hand it to him. She simply held it at her side, her eyes locked on his. "But before you finish that toast," Elena continued, her voice gaining a cold, sharp edge, "there's a small matter of the midnight filing you might want to discuss with Mr. Sterling." Silas's brow furrowed, his grip on the champagne glass tightening. "What are you talking about? This isn't the time for your nonsense, Elena. Move aside." "It's exactly the time," she replied, a small, dangerous smile finally touching her lips. "Because Julian can't inherit a legacy that's already been sold." The silence that followed was absolute. Silas looked toward the back of the room, his eyes searching for Arthur Sterling. He found him. The lawyer wasn't looking at the podium, he was looking at his watch. Silas turned back to Elena, the first flicker of genuine doubt crossing his face. "What did you do?" he hissed, leaning over the podium, the microphone catching his jagged breath. Elena didn't answer with words. She simply stepped back, giving him the floor. She had spent years being the ghost in this house. Now she was going to enjoy being the one who haunted it. She looked at the guests, then back at her father, whose face was beginning to turn a sickly, pale shade of gray. "The toast, Silas," she prompted softly. "You were saying something about the future." The silence in the ballroom was no longer respectful. It was suffocating. The overpowering scent of white lilies, which had seemed elegant moments ago, now felt like the cloying perfume of a funeral parlor. Silas stood frozen at the podium, his fingers still curled around the crystal flute he had intended to raise in a victory lap. He looked at the back of the room, where Arthur Sterling stood with his arms crossed, his expression as unreadable as a tombstone. With a practiced, silent motion, the lawyer tapped a command into his tablet. The massive digital screen behind the podium, which had been cycling through curated photos of Vance family, successes, flickered and died. A second later, it roared back to life, bathed in the cold blue light of a legal document. It wasn't a photo. It was a deed of sale, stamped with the official seal of the state treasury and dated 48 hours prior. At the bottom, in the space reserved for the primary shareholder and new owner of the Vance estate, the name was written in bold, unmistakable script, Elena Vance. Silas's jaw didn't just drop. It seemed to unhinge, his mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged O that made him look suddenly, pathetically old. The healthy, Scotch-fueled flush of his cheeks vanished, replaced by a gray, curdled pallor that mimicked the ash of a dying fire. His eyes, usually sharp with a predator's arrogance, bulged behind his glasses, darting frantically across the legal seals on the screen as if he could wish the ink away. A single, heavy bead of sweat broke from his receding hairline and tracked a slow, glistening path through the deep furrows of his forehead, while his hands, still gripping the mahogany podium, shook so violently that the wood groaned under the strain. He looked like a man watching his own execution in high definition. The reaction from the floor was instantaneous. The sharp, crystalline ring of a champagne flute shattering against the marble floor echoed through the hall. Beatrice Vance had let her glass slip, her manicured hand flying to her throat as she stared at the screen. She looked at her husband, then at the daughter she had spent a decade ignoring, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning realization. Beside her, Julian Vance had turned a sickly shade of green. The smug, entitled smirk he'd worn all evening was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a man who had just watched his entire future evaporate. He reached out as if to steady himself on a nearby table, but his hand missed, and he stumbled, looking small and fragile in his $3,000 suit. In the shadows near the bar, Marcus Thorne didn't look away. The rival investor leaned back, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face as he watched the Vance patriarch crumble. He began to clap, a slow, rhythmic, and devastatingly mocking sound that cut through the stunned murmurs of the guests. "You're lying," Silas finally choked out, his voice a pathetic rasp that didn't even carry to the second row. He turned to Elena, his eyes bloodshot. "This is some pathetic stunt. You don't have that kind of money. You're a nurse, for God's sake. You're nothing." Elena didn't flinch. She stood in the center of the storm, the calmest person in the room. She looked at the man who had spent 20 years telling her she was the family's greatest disappointment, and for the first time she felt nothing but a cold, clinical pity. "I was a nurse, Silas," she said, her voice amplified by the microphone he'd forgotten to turn off. It was steady, melodic, and terrifyingly final. "And as a nurse, I learned how to spot a terminal case long before the patient did. This house, this legacy, your reputation, it's been dead for years. I just stopped paying for the life support." She stepped closer to him, her heels clicking with lethal precision on the marble. The guests leaned in, their faces a mask of morbid fascination. "You spent 40 years building a throne out of other people's sacrifices," she whispered, though the silence was so deep that even those at the back heard her. "I just decided it was time to collect the rent. You have until noon tomorrow to vacate the property. Arthur has the injunctions ready." She didn't wait for his reply. She didn't need to see the tears that were finally beginning to well in his eyes or hear the frantic excuses he was trying to form. She turned her back on the podium and began to walk toward the grand exit. The crowd parted for her like a retreating tide. She could feel their eyes on her, the judgment replaced by a sudden, desperate respect. As she reached the heavy oak doors, she paused and looked back one last time. Silas Vance was still standing at the podium, but he wasn't a wolf anymore. He was just a man standing in a house that no longer belonged to him, surrounded by people who were already looking for someone new to follow. Elena stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy doors thudding shut behind her, sealing the ghost of her past inside. She pulled her phone from her clutch and saw a single notification from Marcus Thorne. "The board is waiting. Shall we tell them the rest?" She didn't reply. Not yet. The house was hers, But the real war for the Vance name was only just beginning. 10 minutes after the doors had closed, the silence of the night was shattered by the sound of Silas Vance's desperate footsteps echoing across the marble foyer. He burst through the exit, his tuxedo jacket disheveled, trailing a wake of stunned socialites and board members. Elena stood by the idling black sedan, her silhouette framed by the moonlight. She didn't turn around as he reached her, his breath coming in ragged, whiskey-scented hitches. "You think a few forged documents and a theatrical exit change anything?" Silas spat, his voice cracking with a frantic, high-pitched edge. "I am the head of this family. I am the Vance name. You are nothing but a nurse who got lucky with a few investments." Arthur Sterling stepped out from the shadows of the stone pillars, clutching a leather-bound folder to his chest like a shield. Behind him, Beatrice Vance and Julian Vance hovered in the doorway, their faces pale masks of uncertainty. The crowd of witnesses spilled out onto the gravel drive, their hushed whispers sounding like the dry rustle of dead leaves. "They aren't forged, Silas," Arthur said, his voice steady and clinical. "I've spent the last hour verifying the digital signatures with the land registry." The transfer of the estate was executed 5 years ago. The holding company that pays the taxes, the staff, and even your personal allowance is a subsidiary of Mercer Holdings, which, as of tonight, we have confirmed is owned solely by your daughter. Silas's face underwent a grotesque transformation. The high, aristocratic color that usually defined his cheeks drained away, leaving behind a sickly, gray pallor that made him look 20 years older in a heartbeat. His eyes, usually sharp with calculated cruelty, became unfocused and glassy, darting around the drive as if searching for a trapdoor in the gravel. His lower lip developed a persistent, rhythmic tremor that he couldn't suppress, and a thin sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead, matting his silver hair against his skin. The terrifying realization that his foundation had turned to sand was written in every twitch of his jaw and every shallow, ragged breath he took. His hands, which had spent decades pointing fingers and demanding service, now hung limp and useless at his sides. "Beatrice," Silas croaked, turning toward his wife. Tell them she's lying." Beatrice didn't move toward him. She adjusted the heavy diamond necklace on her throat, a piece Elena had likely paid for, and took a deliberate step backward, closer to the safety of the house. She looked at her husband not with love, but with the cold, calculating eyes of a woman realizing her lifeboat was sinking. Julian was even faster to flip. He tucked his hands into his pockets and stared at his polished shoes, refusing to meet his father's gaze. The son knew where the money was now, and it wasn't with the man shouting in the driveway. Marcus Thorne stepped forward, his presence commanding the attention of the lingering board members. He checked his watch with a click of his tongue. "The board has seen enough, Silas. We've been wondering why the company's overhead was being diverted into private accounts. Now we know. You weren't embezzling. You were being subsidized by the very person you claimed was a burden to the firm." "I built this," Silas screamed, the sound echoing off the stone walls of the mansion. "Everything you see, I created." Elena finally turned. She looked at him with a clinical detachment that seemed to disturb him more than anger ever could. The cold wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, but she didn't blink. "You didn't build a legacy, Silas. You built a debt. You spent 30 years spending money you didn't earn and claiming credit for work you didn't do. I didn't take this house from you tonight. I simply stopped pretending it was yours." She reached into her small clutch and pulled out a single, heavy brass key. It was the key to the master study, the inner sanctum Silas had used to lock her out of family decisions for a decade. She didn't hand it to him. Instead, she dropped it into Arthur's open palm. 30 days, Elena said, her voice a calm, low vibration that carried easily to the furthest witness. "That is the grace period for the previous tenants to vacate the premises. After that, the locks will be changed, and the Vance name will be removed from the gates." "You can't do this to your own father," Silas whimpered, the bravado finally collapsing into a pathetic whine. "I'm not doing this to my father," she replied, stepping toward the open car door. "I'm doing this to a tenant who is behind on his rent. Arthur will handle the inventory of the personal items you're allowed to keep. Anything purchased with Mercer funds stays with the estate. She slid into the back seat of the sedan. As the driver began to pull away, Elena glanced through the tinted window. Silas was standing alone in the center of the drive, the headlights of the departing cars illuminating his trembling form. The board members were already huddled around Marcus, their backs turned to the man who had been their king only an hour ago. Elena leaned back against the leather seat, the tension that had lived in her spine for 5 years finally beginning to uncoil. Her phone buzzed in her lap. It was a message from an unknown number, but she knew the tone immediately. The locks are already being changed at the downtown office. Where should we send his personal effects? She didn't reply. She watched the iron gates of the estate shrink in the distance, the gilded V on the bars flickering once in the moonlight before disappearing into the dark. The house was settled, but as the city skyline rose to meet her, she knew the boardroom was the next floor that needed to be cleared. Silas was a ghost. Now she had to deal with the men who had helped him haunt her. 6 months had passed since the iron gates of the estate had closed behind her for the last time. Elena Vance sat in the high-backed leather chair of the corner office, the one her father had guarded like a throne for 3 decades. The view of the city was different from this height, clearer, colder, and stripped of the illusions that had once clouded her vision. She traced the edge of the mahogany desk, which smelled faintly of expensive teak oil, and the bitter, dark espresso steaming in a porcelain cup beside her. The company was no longer Vance Holdings. She had rebranded the firm to EV Strategic Partners within weeks of the takeover, scrubbing the family name from the lobby walls as if it were a stubborn stain. She was no longer the secret pillar holding up a crumbling dynasty. She was the foundation, and the architecture of her new life was built on steel rather than lies. Across town, in a district where the streetlights hummed with a persistent, flickering buzz, Silas Vance lived in a space that barely accommodated his ego. The apartment was a 3rd-floor walk-up that smelled of stale cigarettes and damp plaster. He sat on a threadbare sofa, staring at a television that only caught a handful of channels. His designer suits, the ones he used to boast cost more than a nurse's yearly salary, were boxed in the corner. They were useless now. The fabric was too fine for the life he led, and the man inside them had shrunk. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over Elena's name in his contacts, but he didn't dial. He knew the calls wouldn't go through. His daughter had blocked him the day the final audit was released, the day the world learned that his genius had been nothing more than a series of sophisticated thefts from his own child's accounts. The public humiliation had been absolute. He was a pariah in the clubs where he once held court, a cautionary tale whispered over martinis by the very men who had once called him a king. A soft knock at the office door broke Elena's focus. Arthur Sterling entered, carrying a leather briefcase that looked as seasoned and reliable as he did. He didn't wait for an invitation to sit. Their relationship had shifted from attorney and client to something closer to mutual respect. "The final liquidation of the upstate properties is complete," Arthur said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, minimalist room. He placed a single document on the desk. "The proceeds have been moved into the foundation's endowment, as you requested." Elena nodded, her eyes scanning the figures. "And the stipend for my mother?" "Beatrice is settled in the cottage in coastal Maine," Arthur replied, his expression softening. "She's complaining about the salt air ruining her hair, but the staff says she started gardening. It's a quiet life, perhaps the one she should have had all along." "And Silas?" Arthur hesitated, adjusting his glasses. "He's been seen at the local tavern near his apartment. He tells anyone who will listen that he's consulting on a major merger. No one believes him, of course. He's become a local fixture, the man who had everything and threw it away on a grudge." Elena felt a dull ache in her chest, a phantom pain from a limb that had long since been severed. She thought of her brother, Julian, who was currently drifting through cheap hostels in Eastern Europe, too ashamed to return to a city where his name was synonymous with fraud. The cost of her victory wasn't measured in the millions she had recovered, but in the silence that filled her Sundays. There were no more family dinners, No more shared holidays, no more pretenses. He asked for an increase in the monthly allowance again, Arthur added, pulling a small envelope from his pocket. He claims the heating in his building is substandard. Elena took the envelope but didn't open it. She knew what it contained, a handwritten plea, likely filled with the same gaslighting tactics he had used for 24 years. He would tell her he loved her. He would tell her he was proud of her. He would tell her he was sorry, not for what he did, but for the fact that she had caught him. The court-mandated minimum is all he receives, Elena said, her voice steady and devoid of the rage that had once fueled her. Not a cent more. If the building is cold, tell him to buy a blanket with the money he used to spend on silk pocket squares. Arthur nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. I'll handle it. When he left, the office returned to its pristine silence. Elena stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Below, the city moved in a rhythmic blur of headlights and ambition. She touched the cold glass, her reflection staring back at her. She looked like a stranger, someone formidable, someone who had survived a war and won the territory, only to realize the land was scarred. She had her justice. She had her wealth. She had the respect of every board member who had once looked through her as if she were made of air. Marcus Thorne now waited in her lobby for 10 minutes before she granted him an audience, a small but satisfying reversal of the years he had spent dismissing her. But as the sun dipped below the skyline, painting the clouds in bruised purples and golds, Elena realized that the ultimate karma wasn't just Silas's poverty. It was her own peace. She no longer had to look over her shoulder. She no longer had to wonder which of her successes he would claim as his own. She picked up the porcelain cup, the coffee now cold and bitter on her tongue. She took a sip anyway, leaning back against the desk. The house was settled, the ghosts were laid to rest, and for the first time in her life, the silence wasn't a weight. It was a clean slate. She set the cup down and reached for the next file, the future finally belonging entirely to her.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.